Okay, great. So as I was saying before we started the recording, unfortunately, Sarah, my wonderful colleague who you all met last week, if you were with us last week, is quite sick this week. So I'm flying solo. But yeah, my name is Amanda. Were all of you with us last week, or do we have some new folks? So a mix of new and old folks. Okay, so I will reintroduce myself. Great. So I'm the Hub's activist resource person. I Speaking of youth, got my start in organizing as a student organizer on my campus at the University of Toronto. I was doing fossil fuel divestment organizing. There was a lot of conflict there. And since then, I've done a bit of work on like anti-pipeline stuff, worked with a few different NGOs in paid organizing roles and grassroots groups, Indigenous solidarity work, some municipally based work. And I've seen over time just like how common conflict is, but how in life, but also in movement spaces too, and just how little it's talked about. And I think in my experience, the more we talk about it, the more we like get comfortable with it. Don't feel so much like shame and taboo-ness attached to it, and just get comfortable thinking through practices. Like we all go to these workshops on campaign development and like canvassing 101 and House Meetings 101. And I think there could be more space to talk about just conflict 101, 102. And that's kind of what we're hoping to do with these two workshops. So the little surprise I was telling you about, I've been being a bit, yeah, wishing Sarah good luck, is I'm just gonna put here a link to a little survey. If you want to do it, you don't have to. It would be really helpful. We have a pre and post workshop survey. It should take you about like, I don't know, 4 minutes. And it'd be helpful for us to kind of gauge like how you're coming into this workshop, and then at the end, how well I did. And at the end, the pre one will be pretty short, but at the end there'll be space to share like feedback. So if you don't mind filling it out, it would be really helpful. You don't need to answer all the questions. The first question is your date of birth, and that's just so that we can link the pre and post response without you having to tell us your name. So I'll give you a few minutes for that. Hi, Alyssa. Thanks for joining us. I will re-drop in the chat. We're just filling out a little pre-workshop survey. If you feel comfortable, it's to help us gauge how folks are coming into the workshop and how folks are leaving, and for us to improve. So if you can fill out before we get started, that would be so helpful to us.
Sweet. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Zane, I probably should have started the recording after the workshop survey, because there's going to be I'll just cut this part out when we send it. And maybe let me know in the chat when you're done. Yay. Okay, I will let folks, if you need a bit more time, you can continue, but I'll start moving along. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing that for us. So as part of this virtual gathering here, this more intimate gathering of a few of us here today, we know we're coming from different parts of so-called Canada, and it's important for us at the Hub to acknowledge the colonial origins of the nation state of Canada, the harms that colonialism has brought to Indigenous and racialized people, and the continuing reality of unresolved land theft that Indigenous folks have to live with, as well as how that intersects with the deepening climate crisis and the impacts of the climate crisis. I posted earlier in the chat the link to nativeland.ca, but if you want to pull that up, it's a evolving website that helps you kind of familiarize yourself with the languages and territories and treaties of the lands where you're coming from. But the Climate Justice Organizing Hub is based on the territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka, who are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And the island, colonially known as Montreal, is also known as Tiohtià:ke in Kanien'kehá:ka, a language of the Iroquoian family. And this has historically been a meeting place for many diverse Indigenous nations. As part of our approach to understanding meaningful land acknowledgement, Hub team members sought the wisdom of Indigenous land defender Ellen Gabriel, who you can see on this slide. And she spoke to the Hub in 2021 about the importance of moving beyond just kind of a checkbox land acknowledgement, but also thinking about how histories and the present and the structures of colonial land dispossession continue to frame the context that we're organizing in, especially regarding climate change. So there's a link on that slide there, which for the purpose of not disrupting my screen share, I'm not going to post, but you'll get it in the when we send out the link. She speaks briefly in a 4-minute video about recommendations for moving beyond just a land acknowledgement, and I'll just kind of summarize, but the main thing that she recommends is to think about how a land acknowledgement shapes whatever it is that we're doing together. So today we're talking about conflict. And last week in our part 1, if you're with us, we talked a little bit about how conflict, at least when it gets to a point of crisis, often involves a combination of many different factors, some of which are shaped by structures of oppression, including colonialism, how the history of land dispossession creates both material but also embodied ongoing traumas for both settler and Indigenous folks. We can also think about how settler norms of decision-making, both within, treaties and land theft, but also in the ways we continue to relate to each other today. There are a lot of assumptions and that we need to kind of unpack and think about how that affects how we're approaching conflict and how we can use conflict as opportunities to deepen relationships, to deepen understandings of our shared but uneven histories. So, as I've kind of alluded to, am I missing anything in the chat here? No, we're good. Okay. So this workshop has 2 parts. Can I get a show of hands who was here last week? Is it just Kate? Okay. And Nico, yeah, I remember you were here with last week. Thank you. So last week we talked about avoiding preventable conflict and building conflict skills. So this was really about laying the foundation. I like to think that 80% of the work of generative conflict is in getting the groundwork right. We talked about things like structure and culture, but the focus today is more on when conflict happens, because it's bound to happen, it's inevitable. What are some practical tools that we can use in that context? So I'll do a brief recap. These are standalone pieces, but just to recap what we talked about last week. We talked about how conflict is a normal part of life and of organizing. and how there are structures and practices that we can put into place to minimize destructive conflict and also better prepare for generative conflict. So destructive conflict being conflict that's not life-giving, that's like taking away from life, that it's oppressive, and generative conflict being moving towards greater connection, deeper understanding, life-giving. We talked about how many conflicts could be really easily prevented through just having sound structure, team structure, clear decision-making, and regular group assessments that foster collective learning through things like pre-mortems and before and after action reviews, so making that a part of our normal organizing practice. We also talked a bit about how a healthy group culture requires regular upkeep. It's like keeping your house in order. So things like community agreements help lay a strong foundation, but we also need to put them into practice and keep them alive. Many of the skills that are most needed in a really heated conflict, things like active listening and talking about our feelings, they're really hard to do, and they're not practiced or even valued that much in broader society. So it's no surprise that in the heat of conflict, we're sometimes struggling a little bit to put those skills into practice, and how creating intentional time and space to build these skills is really essential. And lastly, we talked a little bit about seasonality or dips and valleys in movement cycles, and how an awareness of the difference between a comfort zone and a stretch zone can help prevent disappointment and stress while cultivating sustainability in organizing. So if you want to share in the chat, if you were with us last week, what was your biggest takeaway? And if you're here for the first time, what's your biggest hope for today's workshop? We're a quiet group today. Biggest hope for today's workshop: expand my toolkit for helping young activists deal with conflict and facilitating mediation with them in a couple of days. Wow, yeah, that's big. Okay, I hope some of the tools today are helpful. Hope to learn more about intercultural conflict. Okay. Transforming conflict in a co-housing situation. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, great. We can get started. Oh, another one. Shared somewhat of what I learned in last week's workshop during our mutual aid group's decision-making meeting creation this past Saturday. Oh, amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. I hope it was helpful. Hoping to get familiar with some tools to transform conflict where there is the staff volunteer power dynamic. Yeah, okay. I think some tools will be helpful in that situation, but you can let me know after. Big takeaway from last week was learning about attending to seasonality. Oh, I'm so happy that was helpful. Yeah, great. Okay, that was also very helpful to me when I first read about it, and that's why I put it in the workshop. Um, yes, I can briefly explain seasonality. So we talked about basically how there are seasons of leadership, but also seasons of organizations. Organizations go through seasons, movements go through seasons. Another way to think about it would be movement cycles, like how there can be like dips and valleys. And the reason why this was important to think about is that sometimes, especially like new folks who come into movement work, sometimes you get brought in at the height of like a high intensity moment, like what's happening right now with Palestine and the solidarity work, the incredible work that's happening. And sometimes, especially if you're new to organizing, there can be a tendency to like bring that high adrenaline, like urgent energy and like keep it in our everyday organizing, even when we're no longer in that peak. Maybe we're now in a valley, and how if we continue operating from that mindset, which sometimes there are urgent things, but it can kind of create unnecessary stress or like a false sense of urgency that isn't always helpful to organizing culture if we're always operating in crisis mode. That can make it more difficult to, yeah, work well together. So does that answer your question? Yes. Okay, so we'll move into the main topic for today. So the first thing I want to talk about is conflict transformation. So the idea with conflict transformation, or well, in any conflict, the the two parties start out seeing their perspectives as opposing or incompatible. That's why we're in a conflict. We're at this point where we can't move through it. It seems like there's something just completely incompatible and we're stuck. But the idea with a conflict transformation is that we go through a process where the perspectives of the people involved shift in some way, even if it's ever so slightly, even if it sounds impossible. Perspectives shift, and this leads to a new understanding of each party's needs. It could also lead to a new understanding of what the conflict was even about. But there's understanding and growth in some way, and the outcome hopefully is that the relationship dynamics actually change in some way, fostering growth, adaptation, and perhaps even deeper connection. And so I like to use the word conflict transformation instead of conflict resolution, because resolution sometimes, though not always, can imply that like one person is right and the other one is wrong, and we just need to like settle the score somehow, like get this thing settled based on established rules and norms. And so the conflict could be resolved, but it might not actually address the underlying relationship dynamics, which is what conflict transformation is about. We're trying to get to that deeper layer of needs, unmet needs, and understanding. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is conflict infrastructure. So what is conflict infrastructure? It sounds like a big word. It sounds maybe a little bit scary, but it's not. It's just a fancy way of saying dedicated and established elements within an organization or a movement and ecosystem pertaining to conflict. So the same way we have like structures in place for like campaign development or for I don't know, other things, we should have some kind of structures or infrastructure in place to deal with conflict. And this is a pretty broad term. It doesn't have to be super big. It could be something as simple as dedicated social support or emotional energy, labor, time, resources, processes, procedures. I'm reading this list backwards, policies, that type of thing. And its purpose is to address conflicts that arise within an organization or the broader movement ecosystem. And the reason why it's important to have conflict infrastructure in place is that if you don't, it's possible that conflicts will be just kind of simmering underneath the surface and people don't know who they can go to or if there's anyone that they can go to. And then it escalates to the point of crisis where it's like not impossible, but a lot harder to handle. So if we have some of these protocols in place, it can help with that. And some of the things that we talked about last week, if you were with us, are kind of like the conflict first aid. If we're doing things like the pre-mortems, before and after action reviews, that will mitigate a lot. Things that could have escalated to conflict will just kind of get addressed in everyday work. But it's still useful to have some elements in place to deal with conflict when they arise. So this and the next slide just kind of give an overview of what that might entail. By no means, you don't need to have all of these things if it seems overwhelming. I just want to lay that out there. This is just a menu of possibilities of what could be conflict infrastructure. So it could be things like having internal mediators or facilitators. So Joshua who was it? Was it Joshua? I can't see the names. Who was the person who's Joshua? Yeah, Joshua's doing that, exactly. I don't know if you're like a trained mediator, if you just have that skill, but yeah, perfect. So that's an example of conflict infrastructure. Having anonymous feedback channels where people can like anonymously fill out a form and they know it will go to a designated person who can then respond in some way if someone doesn't want to like directly bring someone up in person. It could be things like expectations and consequences for in-group behavior during a conflict that's kind of laid out ahead of time before a conflict arises. Decision-making processes, so things we talked about last week, that could be part of conflict infrastructure. Also things like decision-making processes for time-sensitive things, like how are we going to do something in a moment where there is a little bit of urgency. structural changes and power redistribution that might not seem like conflict infrastructure, but it's all related. So that could be an example of conflict infrastructure, ways that we can change the structure of the organization. And then these last three are a little bit more like advanced, a bit outside the scope of the types of conflicts we've been talking about in these two workshops, but referral lists for mediators, counselors, facilitators, and money to like compensate them, harm response protocols, and rapid response networks. This would be for more escalated things like violence, which we haven't been covering in these two workshops. If you already have community agreements, which we talked about last week, that's kind of what I had. Yeah, here, it would be really easy to just kind of have a little section on conflict within your community agreement. And it's helpful to have this stuff in place and communicated clearly to new people that you're recruiting into your organization. So it's already known that like, we know that conflict happens. This is how we address it. This is who you can go to, so that it's not a surprise when conflict happens. The big thing I'll say here is that to avoid getting overwhelmed and going down a really big rabbit hole where everyone like goes and studies transformative justice for like a year, just start small with manageable steps, and really prioritize where there's already group motivation, buy-in, and capacity. So you want to get clear on like, yeah, what's the motivation for building conflict infrastructure here? Are we trying to navigate, interpersonal tensions in the group? Are we trying to navigate tensions between our group and another group? Getting clear on the motivation is really important so that, like with any other conflict too, you're not pulling in different directions. And getting consent before a conflict arises is all really important. So yeah, just like build gradually, start small. Even small structures can really make a big difference. It's also important not to overpromise. So again, if you're dealing with like small interpersonal tensions, I would not recommend going back to your group and proposing to create a process to deal with actual like physical violence. It's both too big for where you're starting, and also it could be it could be really problematic to set high expectations for people who actually are going through that level of harm if you're not then able to provide what you promised. So start small and build from there. And this is just an example of like what this could look like. It doesn't need to be super complicated. It's something as simple as like person who's experiencing conflict can go to this person for support, or this body or circle or working group, who then does X within X amount of time. And you could have, types of situations and the types of responses. And some of the tools that we'll talk about today are things that you could build into a process like that. Okay, so the remainder of this workshop today is really about finding solutions to collective, or finding collective solutions to conflict through practical tools. The tools that I'm sharing with you today are tools that we really believe that small grassroots groups, even with limited capacity, can use and employ to help clarify what's going on in the conflict, to surface unmet needs and come up with collective solutions, and also move towards greater understanding and connection. It might seem scary to try this out, but I really want to encourage you to make use of these tools and resources first before calling in an external mediator or going to some professional body. You don't need to be a professional to do good conflict resolution. You just need to want to do it and to have a few key skills and practices at your disposal. And it's good practice, and it can really help build conflict resilience within your groups. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called conflict mapping, which is a tool for getting underneath the surface of a conflict. So why do we use maps? Well, similar to in everyday life, we use maps to find our way around. And sometimes in a conflict, you also need a map, because sometimes the conflict is so messy, you're like, how did we even get here? I don't even remember what it's about. what's the beef going on with these two people? A map can help just clarify where people are coming from, where we're trying to go. It can offer a more complete picture to better understand what's going on, what the conflict is about. And then once we have that clarity, move towards potential solutions that actually meet the needs of everyone involved. So the key point here to think about is positions, interests, and needs. So we can dig deeper into the layers of a conflict by exploring these three ideas. So your position in a conflict is your initial response or your opinion or your solution to the conflict. I think we need to do this, or I think we need to do that. And oftentimes when we're in heated conflict, we stay at the level of the positions and just try to like argue or debate what the correct course of action is. But this doesn't get to the two deeper layers, which I'm going to show in a picture on the next slide, which are interests and needs. So your interests are what's beneath your initial response, what's important to you in this particular situation, or what are your concerns or fears about the issue. And then the very lowest level is needs. So beneath our interests, these are universal needs, things that we all have, like the need or desire for belonging, which is so, so important. The need to be respected or to be understood, to feel competent, to have connection with others. These are very natural human needs that we all have and can all relate to, and so often are at the very root of a conflict is that there's a core unmet need that is not being met. So that's what we can see in this picture here. So this is a conflict triangle. This comes from the resource Seeds for Change in the UK. So I'll just go through this example. So basically it has the positions, interests, and needs. So we can imagine there are two people here. Lindsay and John, let's say they're imagining there are two people in a group context. Let's say John is one of the founders of the group. He's been around for a long time. Lindsay's maybe a newer member. They're in conflict of some sort. And Lindsay's initial position in this conflict is that John should just talk less in meetings. John is taking up so much airtime, and Lindsay is really annoyed by this and wants him to just talk less. And John's position is, how dare you? This group wouldn't even exist without me. How can you be saying that I should talk less? Like, I'm doing all this work. I should be talking more, if anything. But then if we look beneath the surface, and these triangles are kind of designed to look a little bit like an iceberg too. So the position is really just like the top like 10th, and then below the surface is the other 9/10. So we can look here now at the second layer, which is the interest. So for Lindsay, she's thinking, I want more space to share my ideas. And I'm also concerned that people might leave the group if there's so little room for other people's ideas. And John's interests are, I want this campaign to win, and I'm concerned that people might leave the group if it hasn't got a direction. So already we can see both Lindsay and John actually have this shared interest of they're worried people are going to leave the group for slightly different reasons. And then in the kind of middle of this triangle, we see they have a common interest of, I want this group to thrive. So they both really want the group to do well. And then finally, underneath that, we can see the needs. So for Lindsay, a need that is not being met in this situation is her need for equality. She's feeling like there's no equality or lack of equity within the group, and that's why she wants John to speak less. John really wants the group. He has a need for effectiveness, and that need is not being met right now, and that's why he's responding in the way that he is. And both of these people have a need to be valued in the group. So even if the needs don't overlap in the conflict, drawing them out this way can still be really helpful, because we've all felt this way at some point in our lives. We've all felt that sinking feeling of, I don't belong here, or I'm not valued, or I feel like I'm not competent right now. Like I can't do my job effectively. These are human, very human, difficult to talk about feelings, but we've all felt that way before. So even if you can't initially understand the position of John or of Lindsay, you can relate on a human level to that need for equality, need to be valued, that need to be effective. And planning it out this way can help us kind of soften a little bit and move towards solutions. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a few minutes. I don't know if you have a piece of paper or something, or on your computer, but think of a conflict. Maybe you're in a conflict right now, or you've had a conflict in the past. Think of some conflict you've been in. And yeah, draw your own triangles and try to think about what was your position, interests and needs, and then try to think about what were the position, interests and needs of the other party. Even if you're just guessing at it, try to think about what those were. I'm actually gonna drop in the chat. Okay, so I put in the chat in case you need some prompting. These are just examples of needs. So things like awareness, challenge, clarity, competence, joy, authenticity, acceptance, appreciation, belonging. Yeah, that might be helpful. Okay, do folks need a bit more time? Or are we feeling good? Okay, we can take a bit more time. Okay, well, as folks are kind of still working with that and you can continue on your own time afterwards, yeah, how did that go for folks? Any challenges, insights? Does the triangle framework work for more than two people? Very good question. So you could draw more triangles if you want, but actually the next exercise that I'm going to show you is a little bit better equipped for a group of people. And Barbara says, I'm feeling very good about bringing this exercise to our core team. Yes, okay, great. Yeah, okay, so just one question I wanted to kind of pose to you all is like, I don't know if this felt easy or hard for you. First time I did this, it was like a little bit challenging, and I just wanted to ask, like, why might it be difficult for us as organizers to like kind of get past the position phase and think about the interests and needs when we're engaging in conflict? Any thoughts? Maybe think of the pictures I've put here too. Like, are you on the right side of history? There's no planet B. Is there anything about us as activists that maybe can create a tendency towards getting a bit stuck in our positions?
I was gonna say, and this isn't a fully like formed thought maybe, but because those of us in organizing are often very justice minded and our positions are often informed by like systems and structures of harm and oppression that are larger than ourselves, it can be hard to shake from those positions, especially when they're backed up by like what we view as facts of like oppression and harm. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Nico. That's kind of what I had in mind too. Although I'm gonna read what's in the chat as well. So perception that if we pause for a second to reflect on needs and interests, we might lose momentum. Binary thinking, strong investment in being right. It can feel overwhelming when there's so many perspectives to look at. It's not that I don't want to, it's more so there's a lot to take in. Yeah, but kind of similar to what Nico was saying, what I kind of had in mind here was I think we all become activists because we have a strong kind of visceral reaction to injustice, which is a good thing. And I think maybe perhaps more than other people, like we're a self-selecting group who chose to dedicate our lives to this like really difficult work of organizing. Maybe we're a little bit prone towards that like righteous anger, which is a good thing, which I want to emphasize that like it's good that we're angry. Like it would be, something would be wrong if we get to a point in the world where we see injustice and we just don't feel anything anymore. But it can be hard, as Nico said, to like shake that when we're trying to operate internally. Like when we see a perceived injustice within our own group, it's really easy to get in this like, you're on the wrong side of history, to your own comrade, not only to your enemy in government or in some corporation. Fear of making mistakes too. Yeah, there are like so many factors, fear of failure. And so many of those like are embedded in like other structures of like colonial ways of being and white supremacy culture. So it's no easy feat. We can give ourselves some grace and kind of acknowledge that it's hard to like do this work of like pausing and reconfiguring, and it's challenging, like personal transformative work too, but it's helpful in the long run, I think, not only to our movements, but for our own like understanding of ourselves as people. Okay, so I'm gonna explain now this example. We'll have a break right after this because I know it's been a while. But this example is kind of very similar to the conflict triangle, but it's better suited for groups. So a conflict map is something you could do when there's a few people involved in the conflict. What you're going to need for this is a large sheet of paper and some markers. I highly recommend doing this in person rather than online, although you could do it online, but just it'll be so much easier in person, I think, when there's heavy feelings. You'll need a facilitator or a mediator. So this could just be someone in your group who, is good at synthesizing and hearing many perspectives and hopefully is not one of the most involved people in the conflict. They're like somewhat neutral. And then you're going to need the involved parties. And I know this seems like an obvious step, but like who actually needs to be there and who doesn't? Maybe we don't need an audience. This doesn't need to happen with everyone. It could just be the people who are actually involved in the conflict. And so there's a few steps to this. I'll show in the next slide a picture. The first step you're going to want to do is identify the main issue. that's at stake and write it in the middle of your sheet of paper. So it's going to look like this. And try to write it in as neutral a way as possible without too much like emotionally laden language, kind of an open-ended statement. If you're finding that there are like many issues, just start with one. The conversation might elucidate other things. You could start with the biggest roadblock. You might find that as you start unraveling that, other things become easier. Depending on like how intense this is and also how much time you have, it might be helpful if the facilitator does some one-on-ones beforehand with each of the people, just to kind of understand on their terms how they understand the conflict and the issue at stake. And that might help you as a facilitator, if you're facilitating this, kind of name the issue in a way that everyone will feel okay with naming it. And then you're going to add separate sections for each person. And the facilitator will ask each person to share what their interests, needs, and fears are and write them down. And so for this step, it's really important that there are no interruptions, that we let each person speak in full on their own terms. And this is not the place to be debating or responding. It's just in their own way, in their own terms, what are their interests, needs, and fears. As we kind of talked about with the triangles, it can sometimes be difficult for people to actually to identify for themselves what their interests, needs, and fears are. So if you're finding that people are responding with their solution to the problem, you might need to say as the facilitator, okay, your solution to the problem is this. What needs of yours are being met by that solution? So you can do a little bit of kind of pulling that out as the facilitator to help them get to those needs. So it'll look like this. And then after you have that all out, you can invite everyone to look at the map and just consider the other interests and needs that maybe they hadn't thought about or taken into account. Maybe they had no idea that that was how the other person was feeling. And just that step alone will hopefully help ease a lot of tension and clarify things. Then you can move into step 5, which is discussing solutions that consider everyone's comments. I would recommend doing a kind of like idea storm. You could also do chart paper for this to first generate as many ideas as possible. Don't go into assessing the merits first. In the same way we wanted to move slowly with the interests, we want to move slowly with the ideas as well. Get them all on the table. Even, if there's a pause in ideas, you could then reinstigate. You might be surprised how many ideas emerge. And again, don't assess them. That comes in the next step. And then move towards choosing one solution that works for everyone. The reason why it's so important, though, to not skip any of these steps and to move really slowly is if you try to rush through them, it'll actually take more time than you think. If we do each step on its own, hopefully we can get to a point where a solution that meets the underlying needs can kind of emerge more organically. And then once you do, also define a plan for implementation. So maybe part of the implementation plan is that we need to like reassess in 3 months, or that we need to track something. Don't forget about the implementation step as well. Okay, are there any questions there before we take a break? Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break and then come back at it's 54, so we'll come back. Let's just come back at the hour. Okay. Okay, no, it's not quite the hour, but maybe we can start to come back slowly and I'll share my screen again. Do folks want to share in the chat? What did you do during your break? Or maybe everyone's not back yet because I said come back at the hour. Oh, it's now 6 o'clock. Okay. Um, checked Signal for updates on the youth mediation. Oh, this sounds like it's a stressful situation, Joshua. Or you're just maybe very committed to your role. Replying to an email. No, they're really very sweet. Oh, lovely. Okay. Checked in on kiddo during bath time. Nice, nice, nice. Okay, so as folks get settled back in, we're going to move now into another tool that hopefully is helpful to folks. Oh, I'm just checking. Preparing supper. Yes, perfect. Okay, so this next one is a power mapping or a power map generator tool. You're probably familiar with power mapping in a campaign context when you have like a target and you have to figure out like who's most influential, who has the most power, blah, blah, all these things. But we can also think about power mapping internally in a conflict situation. And this is a tool that is hopefully going to help build empathy, understanding, and also crucially nuance in a conflict situation. And this tool comes from Spring Up, which is a really wonderful like liberation, gender justice, feminist org in the US. And that's where we got this tool from. So I want to start with this quote from the African-American novelist Alice Walker, who says, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." So part of this tool is about clarifying power. We often, well, how many times have you heard people say power dynamics is the problem? Like there's something going on with power dynamics in this group. That's why we have conflict. Yeah, anyone else? Has that ever been an issue in your group? Yeah. Okay. Seen lots of thumbs up. Yeah, it's a common thing. So the goal of this exercise is to kind of gain more clarity about what that means in a specific situation. So the goals are to build empathy and get to know someone better, to better understand what others may or may not be perceiving about you that maybe just wasn't on your radar, you weren't aware of, and to look at the situation in a more complex and nuanced way to kind of get a little bit more granular about power, rather than just kind of throwing around the word. And this can be used to determine, yeah, like what power dynamics are shaping a specific situation or decision, what implicit bias or gaps in perception might be showing up, where there might be projection, which happens a lot in like where you're projecting onto someone something maybe based on a previous situation you've been in, but it's not actually the case in this situation, and where there might be a power struggle at play. So basically the way this works is you would draw it out. We'll show you in the next slide the example that Spring Up has already created. You'll have like two people and like a bunch of lines. And so where you place the lines on the body is corresponds to how much power is being held in that situation. So higher means more power, lower means less power. And then the slope of the line represents the differential between the two people in the situation. So the slope is important, but the thickness is also important because the thickness is going to represent the intensity or relevance of that variable within this specific situation. You want to have 6 lines. They say 6 because if you have fewer, like maybe people are like, oh, there's like race dynamics or gender dynamics are at play here, which may be true, but we want to think about what else is at play. So it's encouraging us to kind of draw out even more, which can be scary, but it's also like helpful. It's a common theme here of like, it's better to put it on the table than to have it just simmering underneath the surface. And the last thing is that it has to be situationally specific. So you could have the same map with the same 2 people be totally different in different situations. So this is also encouraging us to think about the context and think about power as something that is dynamic and context specific. So you just have 6 lines like this. And then this is an example from Spring Up. So this is a real example of 2 people. It's been anonymized for the sake of sharing it with others. So let's say we have 2 colleagues, person A and B, and they're planning a community event together. So in this example, we can see that Person B has more experience with the community that you're planning this event around. And that's a pretty important variable in this situation because it's a community event with that community. So that's a thick line representing that. And the slope shows that person B has more power with regards to that variable. With regards to workplace experience, person A has more workplace experience, and it's a thick line as well because it's a pretty important variable. Your experience in the organization, your knowledge of the organization, like knowledge is power, right? So if you've been in the organization a long time, you just have kind of more tacit knowledge of what's going on that you might have even forgotten how much that affects the situation. So in this example, we have person B is a higher, like they have a higher, they're higher up in the hierarchy, or their band or position in the organization is higher. But this line is thinner in this situation because even though person B is higher up, maybe it's not that relevant to the community event that they're planning, because in that situation, the hierarchy is just less important. In terms of gender, we just have a straight dotted line. So we're assuming both of them, let's say, are both cis women or both trans women. They identify the same way. And then in terms of race, of course, we have a white woman, person B, and a person of color, person A. So that line, we can see a strong slope there. Not as thick, but it's still a strong slope. And then public speaking experience, maybe that's something else that is like relevant to this community event that's being planned. And person A just has more confidence and experience with that. And that's something that gives them power in this situation and shapes how they're navigating the space. So yeah, that's kind of just an example of how you could draw this out. Curious about intersectional identity power dynamics, where being marginalized in the broader society can be a source of more social power in activist groups. For example, I'm a trans person and sometimes notice I am deferred to more in activist groups than cis men are. Feels really complicated to suss out the mix of external view of our identity, real marginalization, and how that works in activist groups. Yeah, wow. So yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, you would have to assess for yourself, like the thickness of the line and the slope. But these are all things that are definitely relevant. I think the idea here is that this would start a conversation. Maybe it doesn't, maybe you can't perfectly capture all of that just in the line, but it starts to encourage to think about kind of the complexity you just talked about, is that it's not so black and white. It's situationally specific. It's specific to the event, it's specific to the group, it's specific to the city you're in. All of these things come into play. Are there any other questions or comments about this? Does this seem helpful, not helpful? I'm seeing lots of strong reacts to Joshua's point, so. Okay, I will move into our next topic, which is actually the last one. And it's an oldie, but a goodie. I think many of us have probably heard of this one before, but it's still so relevant. Calling in versus calling out. So calling out is when we're like drawing attention to harmful behaviors and increasing public pressure. So this is primarily used to identify like harmful behaviors in external targets, people who have institutional, systemic, or cultural power. It might involve demanding like specific behavior changes and redress. And the goal is to draw attention to that harmful behavior, to increase pressure, to bring shame about the actions of that person. This quote here from Adrienne Mary Brown in the book We Will Not Cancel Us kind of provides a bit more context on the history of calling out. So I'll just read this out. She says that callouts have a long history as a brilliant strategy for marginalized people to stand up to those with power. They've been a way to bring collective pressure to bear on corporations, institutions, and abusers on behalf of individuals or oppressed peoples who could not stop the injustice and get accountability on their own. But within our movements today, it has increasingly become a strategy to shame or humiliate people in the wake of misunderstandings, contradictions, conflicts, and mistakes. So kind of the broader point of the book, We Will Not Cancel Us, is that, yeah, sometimes callouts can be misapplied or misappropriated or used in a context where they were not initially intended to be used, and can cause, can be a very alienating and even punitive experience if we end up calling out someone within our group in a way that feels very it's often experienced as punitive for the person who's being called out. But yeah, I mean, it happens sometimes. Sometimes someone who's called out within a group, it might be because there have been efforts to call them in, which we'll talk about in the next slide, that have been unsuccessful. And so they end up being called out either on social media or in a meeting. But as much as possible, we want to try to not call out comrades within our group, and to instead do something which is called calling in. Oh, okay, someone had to leave. I don't know if they've already left. I'm just looking at the chat, but thank you for joining us. Yeah, so calling in is about supporting individuals to like reflect, to maybe there might be some education involved, and hopefully some growth as well. This would typically be done in a more private setting, in a one-on-one conversation, not in a big open meeting with everyone involved or on some public social media channel. It's calling someone calling them in to hold themselves accountable as well. Can anyone think of an example? Has anyone been called in, actually? Maybe you can give an example. Or think of one. No examples of calling in. Okay, well, we're going to talk about it a little more in the next slide, so maybe that'll help clarify. A note I want to say about calling in, though, is, you could call in, your friend outside of organizing, just in casual conversation, they say something that you think is problematic, you call them in. And that's fine. But in the context of an organization of a particular group, for calling in to actually be most effective, you need to have a shared purpose and shared values and guidelines. And that's why we talked about in the first session why it's so important to have community agreements, because otherwise you're just you're calling them in based on your own politics or your own sense of what's right and wrong, your own understanding of justice, which could be an amazing analysis. But then there's less motivation for that person to actually change their behavior if it's just like, well, I think you should have not said that, or I think you should do this differently. It could work depending on the relationship you have with them, but it's more effective if you can pull it back to community agreements that the group has already bought into and has shared, that are part of your onboarding process, and kind of bring it back to what you have collectively decided to uphold as a group. Joshua is saying in the chat, I was called in by another person with a disability. We have competing disability access needs, and she was really generous around educating me about her needs. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, and that actually kind of transitions nicely to the next thing I wanted to say about this slide. Well, maybe I can ask Joshua, like, how did it feel for you being called in?
It felt good, honestly. I really appreciate when people are direct with me, when they have concerns about something I've done, and appreciate when that's done with the intention of helping me learn, and trust that I can learn, that I'm not a hopeless person who will only do things that are crappy.
Okay, that's amazing. Yeah. Okay, that was not the response I was expecting, but that's a really beautiful. I'm like so happy to hear that that was your experience. And I think I can tell just from the little few interactions we've had that I think you have done a lot of probably like personal reflection and emotional maturity. It's just going to be my assessment. Um, the reason I asked is that like sometimes calling in doesn't feel good. And I just wanted to lay that on the table that like we have this distinction between calling in and calling out, and the kind of the assumption is, or it can feel like, oh, calling in is like the nicer way to do it. But it can sometimes still feel shitty to be called in. Maybe it feels great. And I think it would be wonderful if we can all move towards a place of like seeing it as a gift, recognizing the labor that the other person put in, recognizing how generous they were. But if it doesn't feel good, that's also okay. If your like natural response is like, oh, I feel like these beads of sweat now, or I feel like, if that's your response, don't worry, it's okay. But I just wanted to name that um sometimes it's hard, it's hard, we get better at it, but sometimes it's hard to like get called in or out. And it also requires skill on the person doing the calling in. So in Joshua's example, it sounds like this person just did it so beautifully, which is wonderful. But I also just wanted to acknowledge the labor that takes. And sometimes it can be exhausting, especially if you're like coming from a marginalized identity, to like always be doing that calling in and like always doing it in a way that is like super nice and like super generous and super like not pointed, and the right balance of all of these things. And to kind of name that maybe that's a discussion you want to have in your group too. It's like, how do we approach calling in and out in terms of emotional labor too, and how that intersects with identity? Like maybe the men want to call in the other men when there's like sexism or something, or in the example of like disability, if an able-bodied person is like noticing something, maybe they could take it upon themselves to call in another able-bodied person rather than leaving it to like a couple of disabled people in the group to have to like do that extra labor of being really nice about it and educating. And the link that is in this slide, which I can put in the chat, I don't think I'm not gonna play it right now. But if you want to later watch it, it's a really nice video from the TED Talk from Sonia Renee Taylor. And she kind of just talks a little bit about, like the response that people can sometimes have to calling in and out. And she also proposes something called calling on as like a third approach alongside the other two, of like calling on others in the group to like do that work themselves. So it can be similar to calling in, but maybe without so much intellectual and emotional labor on the part of the person calling in. But yeah, basically in summary, a call out is when you like apply pressure to an external target who's engaged in some really harmful behavior. And a call in, hopefully we're trying to do calling in with people in our group, our comrades or potential recruits, and support reflection, education, and growth for that person, rather than putting them on blast in the middle of a meeting in front of all their friends or on social media. Okay, so in our next two slides, does everyone still have the link, or should I repost it to the slides? If you want to join me on this slide, we can take a few minutes to add our thoughts here. So I'll read out the example. So let's say we have a CEO of a fossil fuel company. Oh, okay, I will repost the link. 1 second. This is where I wish Sarah were here. There we go. Let me reshare again. Okay, so let's say like the CEO of a fossil fuel company is visiting a local university to deliver a speech, and this person is notorious for greenwashing on climate change, and they use phrases like a fossil fuel driven economy today means a strong economy for generations to come. So if you could take a few moments to like summarize what would calling out look like in this context? Okay, so we have things like spoofing, their hypocrisy, leaflet, info picket, mass walkout, direct action, disruption, post their CO. I don't know what that means. Post their CO. Okay. Disrupting while they're trying to speak, not allowing them to propagandize, ask them blunt, direct questions about how they personally feel about harm their company is causing. Yes, love this. Exactly. This is something we don't want to do with our own comrade, but absolutely for the CEO, be like super pointed, make it personal, um, as personal as possible about how the harm that their company is causing specific communities. Okay, and then on the next slide, oh, how do I move forward? There we go. Okay, so now we have an example where calling in would be more appropriate. So let's say there's been a meeting and someone in the group is like consistently saying Indigenous Canadians instead of Indigenous peoples. Maybe someone else in the group like tried to say it differently and hoped they would catch on and they just didn't. So like they kept saying Indigenous Canadians. And this is something that this group considers problematic because of the history of settler colonialism and the sovereignty of Indigenous nations, and not so like not calling Indigenous peoples Canadians because of the yeah, like because they are separate sovereign nations on stolen land. So let's say this is like a pretty egregious kind of situation that has happened, but maybe for the person maybe in the room, it feels just like a small slip up. They don't really understand the context. So we could summarize like what would calling in look like in this type of situation. Yeah, okay, so things like a one-on-one convo, offering to do settler co-learning together, check in with affected Indigenous people in the meeting. I found this resource helpful for my own learning, sharing a resource. Trying to read this one here. Check in, hey, something I've learned from Indigenous folks, et cetera, et cetera. Being mindful of Indigenous people in the room if they need care afterwards, yeah. Request a meeting after the group meeting, offer an explanation, resources, analogies that will resonate with this person and help them to understand. Yeah, exactly. All great. We're still there's some education and growth that clearly needs to happen. And if a conversation doesn't happen, this person will just continue to say that. So something needs to happen, but we want to do it in a way that's yeah, like empathetic, understanding, helpful, resourceful, one-on-one. Okay, and then I'll just move to our final slides here. So just to recap, I try to share again. Apologies. Okay. So to recap what we talked about today, so conflict transformation occurs when the involved parties in a conflict start out seeing their positions as incompatible, but they go through a process, maybe using some of the tools we talked about today, that allows for perspectives to shift, leading to changes in relationship dynamics, growth, and adaptation. Conflict infrastructure is kind of a broad term that just encompasses dedicated and established elements within an organization or the broader ecosystem that pertain to conflict. It could be things like procedures, processes, resources, labor, emotional energy, social support. And then tools and practices like conflict mapping, power mapping, and calling in and out can be useful in facilitating conflict transformation. So conflict mapping, which is both the triangles and the maps, this can be used to help us see beyond the involved parties' initial positions and surface underlying interests and unmet needs, helping us to move towards a collective solution. And then power mapping can be used to help clarify power dynamics in a conflict and allow the involved parties to build empathy, understanding, and nuance. And then calling out, which is what we just talked about, is a useful strategy for applying pressure to external targets who are engaging in harmful behavior of some kind, while calling in is an opportunity for group members to engage in reflection, education, and growth. The last thing that I'm going to do is share with you, 1 second. This survey, if you could take a few minutes, either now or after after we leave, it would be so wonderful if you could fill out the post-workshop survey as well, just so we can see yeah, what you gathered from today. It has similar questions to the first one, but the last section is also just more open-ended if you want to share in a paragraph form things that went well or things that had some potential, but also things that you were like, this was not useful. That's helpful information for us. We can make changes. This is our second kind of iteration of this two-part workshop. The first time we did it was last spring, which is actually before I was hired or around the time I was hired. And we've made some pretty big changes to it for this second iteration, but we can always make more changes. So yeah, it's just helpful for us to get that feedback. And if you end up using any of these tools, yeah, send me an email. Let me know how it went. If you made any modifications that were helpful, it's always nice to know, like on the ground, how something actually works. And yeah, at the last couple, I guess I can share my screen one last time here, 1 second. This last slide here, which you will get when Sarah sends out the slide deck, just has further reading and resources, some of which informed this workshop, but also others that we didn't kind of touch on. So they're all linked in that last slide, which you'll get. Oh, thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you for being so inspirational and flexible tonight, especially with most of us staying off camera. Probably my top choice workshop amongst the hub's offerings so far. Oh, that is so sweet. Thank you. Really appreciate your time and care. That is very nice of you all. Okay, I will stop this recording. Wait, how do I stop it without ending the meeting? Oh, you're seeing my like, or I'm so used to Sarah being the one who does this. Stop recording. There we go.